Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Marie Fannin, and I'm the director of the Work Learn Institute at the University of Waterloo. We are so pleased to have you with us for today's session on understanding Gen Z values in the workplace. This is a really hot topic, how this next generation of talent views meaningful work and what you can do to attract and engage them within your organizations. We've had lots of questions from our employers to better understand the perspectives of this next generation and if and how those perspectives have changed over COVID. And when we asked our students to share with us, they were so keen to do so. We have never seen a response rate like we did for this research study. We learned a lot, and we're really excited to share with you today and to engage in this discussion. A quick housekeeping note, we will have time for Q&A towards the end of the presentation, but if you have questions as we go through the presentation, we encourage you to share them with us. You can use this stage pane on the right-hand side of your hop-in window and just pop your questions into the chat. We'll do our best to manage them either as we go through the presentation or towards the end. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And the University of Waterloo's main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract. So that's the land that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River that was promised to the Six Nations. At the University of Waterloo, our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within our Office of Indigenous Relations. As we come together today, we're gathering on other traditional lands across the country, and I acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the many Indigenous peoples with whom we share these lands today. So many of you are quite familiar with the University of Waterloo. If you've joined us in the Future Ready Workforce series before, you're familiar with this slide too. It just highlights a few of the reasons that our university and our co-op programs are unique. You may know that the University of Waterloo was the first post-secondary institution in Canada to offer the cooperative model of education, and we now run the world's largest program of its kind with over 25,000 students going out each year, working in a global network of over 7,500 employers. And of course, the University of Waterloo is home to the Work Learn Institute. At the Work Learn Institute, we study the role that work-integrated learning plays in the development of talent for a complex future. So more specifically, we try to improve the outcomes of participation in work-integrated learning for all of our key stakeholders, employers, students, and ourselves as post-secondary institutions. We do that by conducting and sharing research, offering training and consulting on developing quality work-integrated learning. And we're always seeking new partnerships. So if you have ideas on things that we can explore together from a research lens or a training lens, we would love to hear from you. Please do reach out. This Future Ready Workforce series is designed specifically for our employer partners to share research-informed insights about how you can build your talent pipeline through work-integrated learning. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers that are joining me today. So we have first Dr. David Drury, who is WorkLearn's Associate Director. Dave's research focuses on how participation in work-integrated learning contributes to desirable outcomes for both students and graduates, as well as for our employers. Dave is also an associate editor of the International Journal for Work-Integrated Learning, and he holds a doctorate in Rec and Leisure Studies from the University of Waterloo. We're also really pleased to welcome Ingrid Kaffka, a recent alum. So Ingrid graduated from the University of Waterloo's co-op program in 2022 with a bachelor's degree in English and political science. During her undergrad, Ingrid had the opportunity to obtain experience in 4 different fields, and she's now using the tools she learned to start her career in technical writing. Okay, on to the next slide, please. We'd like to dive into today's session with a little video. So Namish, can you press play for us?
Younger generations are just harder to manage at work, or do they just have different workplace values? A lot of videos and articles saying that this younger generation is just harder to manage. Now, are they different to manage? Yes, I think so. When you take a step back and you look at the workplace values as a whole, you will see some shifts. Terminal values like stability, security, financial independence are much different than values like autonomy, competence, efficiency, flexibility. No matter where you fall on the spectrum of what your prioritized values are, you can see this play out in your decision making throughout your career. Are you staying at one location for a long period of time? Or are you more comfortable job hopping, hoping to find those values that align? It's also important to note when you have value misalignments with either your role or the work environment, this constantly feels like friction, going against the grain. These misalignments then feel like demands and can contribute to burnout. As a whole, we need to do better at understanding what people value at work, regardless of the generation. If you don't know your own workplace values or the values of the team around you, you feel a little disconnected, this is a great place to start.
So, as you know, the discussion about intergenerational clashes, especially in the workplace, is not new. But for a number of reasons, including the fact that we're living longer and we're working longer, we are navigating more intergenerational diversity than we ever have before. And there's so much to be gained from this intergenerational diversity if we really can understand each other and the perspectives that we're bringing to our work. And as we watched this video, there was a huge perspective that stood out to us, and that was the focus on values. And that is because this has been shown time and time again in our research to be so important to Gen Z. Your organizations really matter to this generation. And this should matter to you for a few key reasons too. Just from plain demographics, we know that Gen Z is going to be 30% of the workforce by 2030. And we are still in a tight labor market, and we are competing with each other to attract the best and the brightest of that young talent today. Second, youth by their very nature are wired for innovation. And I'm drawing on the work of our colleagues from the University of Waterloo here, Amelia Clark and Alona Doherty, who have shown that simply by the stage of brain development that youth are in, they tend to have capacities and capabilities that align with innovation, that align with an entrepreneurial mindset. And so you can really take advantage of those capabilities if you can find ways to bring and properly support this next generation of talent in your organizations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this values fit predicts organizational attractiveness to this next generation. When we first surveyed our students in 2018, 50% of them said they would not accept an offer working in a role that aligned with their skills, but not with their values. And so, like many of you, we wanted to know if these values had shifted at all during COVID. And we also wanted to learn more about the specific role and workplace preferences of our generation of students. So we set up and sent out a survey in mid-October. And as I said earlier, we were absolutely overwhelmed by the response. Within 2 hours, we had over 2,000 co-op students help us better understand their perspectives on work, on jobs, and on organizations. So to get us all going together, we want to poll you on your perspectives on some of the questions that we asked our students. So the first one we're going to ask you has to do with those core values. What core value do you think is most important to Gen Z? And you should have a poll that's popped up for you. We'll just go to the next slide and I'll give you a brief overview of the values that we asked our students about. So these are based on 10 universal values. And Dave is going to share more about those values with you. I understand we might be having a few network problems. Do we have the poll up and running? No, it's not working. Okay, well, then we'll do this in our heads. We can do this. We've been nothing if not resilient throughout the pandemic. So I will quickly walk you through these. If you can pop your comments into the chat, give a little think on this one, and then we'll share the results with you. So first, benevolence, which was loosely defined for the students as helping others. And then hedonism, enjoying life. Self-direction, loosely defined as exploring one's curiosities. Universalism, which focuses on justice and equity. Security, which focuses on safe communities. Achievement, focusing on standing out from others. Stimulation, looking at adventure and risk. Conformity, which is focused on following rules. Tradition, which is focused on following customs. And then power, being in charge. And these are 10 values that have been shown across time and across cultures to appear. We asked our students these same questions in 2018 and then wanted to know their thoughts in 2022. So take a quick think on that one. And then I think rather than trying to work our way with polls that might not be working, maybe we'll just quickly go to the next question so that we can give the audience a sense of what we asked our students. So the next question focused on organizational values. So what would Gen Z prioritize most when they were looking at a specific organization? And some of the options that we gave them focused on things like an organization that's committed to sustainability, a culture that values equity, diversity, and inclusion, the prestige of the organization, a culture that values individuality, or a culture that supports the training and development of its staff. We asked our students to rank these in terms of their importance when selecting not specifically a role, but more broadly looking at an organization. Okay, next question. So what does Gen Z prioritize most when considering a job? So now we're really getting into the specifics of a role. And some of the things that we gave them to choose from included good benefits, so healthcare, pension, that kind of thing, positive social relationships with their coworkers, good work-life balance, making a positive impact on society directly with their work, job security, a competitive salary, the possibilities for rapid promotion, an attractive geographic location, or perhaps the opportunities for relocation. So those are a few of the things that we ask students to prioritize. And I absolutely love all of the discourse that we've had about Gen Z and kind of their perspectives on work and roles. So really interested to see what you think they would have prioritized most when considering a job. Maybe we'll just take a second with that one, and then I'm going to hand things over to Dave, who's going to do the big reveal and tell you all about what our students shared with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. I was kind of tracking the comment section here. I'm taking note of how many responses we're getting. So thank you so much to our engaged audience, but also trying to pick out some key themes. I'm seeing a lot of the words hedonism and self-direction come up. So we'll have to see in our data whether your perception of Gen Z is consistent with their self-reports. Okay, so we're going to move the slides forward a little bit. I'm going to give you a brief overview about the agenda for the rest of our time together, and then I'll give you some of the results from our survey data. Let's go forward one more slide, will we? So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on values, what they mean, the theoretical orientation underlying the concept of values, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the survey results regarding organizational and job preferences. And while you're all here, we're going to give you some key takeaways regarding how best to support these sorts of preferences. It's really nice to know what young people value, but what does that actually mean in terms of managerial decision making? Hopefully, we're going to leave you with some answers to that question. And then, of course, we'll end our time together with a short question and answer period. So what are values? Obviously, it's a concept that you kind of know in your heart, but just to give some academic rigor to it, the theory of core values is something that comes out of cross-cultural psychology. It was a theory that was developed by people who ask questions like, how do people from different places, different countries see the world differently? What do they value? What do they prioritize? That's the sort of genesis of the theory of core values. And what the theory suggests is that values represent the things that are most important to us in life. They are all associated with a set of goals or motivations. And you can kind of think about them like general driving forces behind human behavior. When people hold one of these 10 things as more important to them, it sort of like guides the things that they want, the things that they seek. And if there's another one of these 10 things that is less important, that has less of an impact on the way that they want to live their lives. A couple things to note, they're like their beliefs, their goals, their actions, they're all like systems of driving forces that are tied together. And the theory suggests that there's 10 of them, which means anywhere you go on Earth, people will resonate with these 10 things to some extent. They might be more important, they might be less important, but everyone can fall on the spectrum for these 10 things, like benevolence, hedonism, the 10 that Anne mentioned earlier. We'll go one slide forward, please. And why this is so interesting is we've all lived through this, pretty crazy set of years the last few years, and there's been a big discourse in mainstream popular media about these themes that you see on the slide here, and it's been titled The Great Rethink. There were articles in the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, kind of like some of the heavy hitters were writing about this notion of the Great Rethink. One that I really like from HBR was called The Great Resignation or The Great Rethink. And it detailed sort of like a one-person case study of someone who was in a high-powered job and said, you know what, I don't think I like this anymore. I'm going to quit. And I think it's like a good representation of what a lot of people felt since 2020. They sort of woke up and thought, what's important to me? Is this really how I want to live my life? And it gave us like a moment to pause and ask those sort of questions. And it's all wrapped up in the COVID-19 pandemic, but I would argue it even started earlier than that, several years ago, with things like financial crises and housing crises and the onset of the gig economy, where people started asking themselves, is this where I want to live? Am I doing what I really want to be doing? And now the things that you're seeing on the slide here, like the physical and mental health epidemics that we're experiencing in Canada, are really prominent for so many people. And they're starting to ask those questions again. What's important to me and how do I want to live my life? I'm seeing a note from Javier Bravo who says, AI is part of the Great Rethink? Yeah, I think so. Really great point. A lot of people are asking questions like, can I be replaced by a computer? What does this mean for the way I want to live the rest of my life? So that got us thinking about, well, what does this mean for the emerging talent, the Gen Z generation? Where do they fall in all of this? Lots of people have talked about millennials and the baby boomers and what that means for their exit for the workforce. But what about Gen Z, the folks who are in their late teens, early 20s right now? Fortunately, we've asked a series of these questions in 2018, which Anne kind of mentioned, and then we had an opportunity to return to some of these questions last year in 2022. So not only do we have a comparison of data regarding core values from 2018 and 2022, but in that 2022 survey, we really dug into what some of these themes might mean for implications of values for organizational management decisions. And that's where we're going next. So I'd like to start by sharing you the sort of general portrait of Gen Z. What does Gen Z look like regarding their core values? And what does that look like in 2018 versus 2022? And there's a couple of things I want to highlight for you. The first is the three most important values are benevolence, hedonism, and self-direction. Anne sort of did a good job, definitely did a good job referencing this, but let me just go a little deeper. Benevolence is broadly defined as helping others, especially one's in-group. It's about enhancing the welfare of people you care about. Hedonism is the search for pleasure, like sort of generally speaking, just wanting to enjoy life. And self-direction is about exploring curiosities and very much underlying the motivation for independence and wanting to be oneself. And what's really neat is that these three values are tied into a broader theme of self-transcendence and openness to change. If you really dive into the literature around the theory of core values, you'll see that these things are actually on like a higher order about change and growth and development. And that we're going to return to that theme later throughout the presentation because it has really big implications for attracting and retaining talent. It tells us that Gen Z is really open to improving, growing, developing over time. And these things very much conflict with some of the things you see at the bottom of the table here, like conformity, tradition, and power. Those things are very much about self-enhancement or conservation of values, which is like the antithesis of being open to change and developing. It's very much about, I just want to do what we're already doing. And what Gen Z are telling us very loudly, very clearly is, yeah, that's not us. Conformity, tradition, power, that's not what we're about. We're very much about helping others, growing, and in particular, growing together. So that's the first big highlight. The second thing is, remarkably, these things have been pretty consistent over the last 4 years. Of the 10 values that we measured, only 4 changed, and really, they didn't change very much. They might have changed in their rank order, one place at a time, which you can see reflected in these up and down arrows in green and red on the far right of the table. But honestly, this is it. So regardless of all of the craziness that's happened over the last few years, this truly is the generational portrait of Gen Z. If you want to appeal to Gen Z, you have to ask yourself questions like, what am I doing to create opportunities for them to help others, to enjoy life, to explore curiosities, to seek justice and equity? And what am I doing to minimize or downplay rules, customs, being in charge, the things that they really don't seem to care that much about? And I'll build on this over the next few slides regarding implications for these core values in organizational preferences and job preferences. So let's go there now. In our survey, we asked students about organizational preferences and job preferences. And for all of the things that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, and that's true of the next few slides, we said, on a scale of 1 to 7, tell us how important this thing is for choosing the sort of organization you might want to work in and the sort of role you want to have after you graduate. And this is the first set of results related to that sort of survey setup. We asked students, what are the series of important characteristics regarding the organizations you want to work in? And very loudly and very clearly, they responded, training and development. We want to work in a place that offers opportunities for training and development. About 8 out of 10 students said that this was either very important or quote unquote essential to their decisions for where they want to work. And it makes sense, right? It resonates with the broader theory of core values regarding things like change and growth. If people in their heart really value living in a world that promotes changing and getting better over time, it would follow that they'd also want to work for an employer that helps them do that. The second couple bars you see here about organizational cultures that value equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and individuality. And they're kind of wrapped up together, right? Because individuality is about being oneself, and EDI is about letting others be themselves. So they go together, they go hand in hand. And again, it's very much connected to the theory of core values in the theme of benevolence and self-transcendence, because if we're helping people be their best selves and welcoming them to go on that journey together, in general in life, it follows that people want to work in places and organizations that help people do that. And then the other thing I want to highlight here is look at the very bottom one, organizational prestige. For generations, this has been a tool that organizations have invested in to try to attract people. They've tried to position themselves in the labor market as being better than, different than, somehow more prestigious than their competing organizations. And Gen Z is pretty clearly telling us, yeah, we don't really care. So you can transfer any resources that have been devoted to that area upward to other things like opportunities for training and development, and building cultures that help people be themselves and their best version of those selves. So those are just a couple key findings regarding organizational preferences. We also have some information about job preferences, which we'll put on the screen for you now. So very, very clearly, you can see that some of these bars suggest over 8 out of every 10 respondents are saying it's very important or essential that I work in a job that offers me excellent work-life balance and a really strong sense of job security, competitive salary, and benefits, which you can kind of wrap together as like a competitive extrinsic rewards package. And there's a couple interesting things about that. So work-life balance, consistent with the idea of values, because if people value change and growth, it's possible that work isn't the only place in which they can do that, or maybe it's not even the best place. Leisure activities, spending time with one's family, hobbies, other things that typically happen outside of traditional work time are actually really great ways to explore oneself and build an identity. Work is a way, but I think Gen Z is saying, yeah, we're fine to work and we're going to work our butt off for you. But also when we're not working, we just kind of want to do our own thing. And that requires a really open and honest conversation about work-life balance. And I think it's a tool, a lever that you can pull to attract Gen Z. The discussion question for you is, what are we doing to offer that sort of work-life balance, and how are we promoting it in our recruitment materials, and how are we offering it to people who are already in the organization? The second set of 3 bars, that sort of external package, I don't actually think has much to do with values. I think it's more a pragmatic response. If you've tracked the news lately, you might be mindful of things like it costs a lot, maybe even by 2030 might cost $3,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto and some of the bigger markets in Canada. And Gen Z, who are kind of at the early stages of life, who might be thinking about starting families, home ownership, they're saying, you know what? Work-life balance is great, but you know what also is really important? Money. Rent is really expensive. Inflation means that I'm spending more money on my groceries. So I also want to work in a place that gives me a sense of security and helps me pay the bills. And this is sort of paradoxical. On the one hand, organizations have always tried to pull that lever, but I think what they need to do now is situate the extrinsic rewards in a bigger package that balances the extrinsic stuff with some of this more like psychosocial stuff, like work-life balance and flexibility. And we'll give you a sense of how you might pull those levers, how you might use those tools over the next few slides. But before that, I wanted to just pause and have a moment for Ingrid to come on screen, because Ingrid is really our representative of Gen Z. She's been through several co-op jobs and is now venturing into the labor market. So we want to get a sense, Ingrid, how are these sort of findings which come from your peers resonating for you? Do you see yourself reflected in any of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with respect to the core values, we dedicate 40 plus hours of the week that we work for the companies that we work for. And so we want to know that in turn, we will receive equal amounts of dedication and care. And so, thinking about hedonism is a lot like work-life balance, or self-direction is still a lot like training and development, or even less important things like power are still a lot like growth and leadership opportunities. Gen Z had a lot of foundational years stripped due to the pandemic, which highlighted how these values are ever more important in our day-to-day lives, and especially now in our careers. And I think our values are different from other generations because our opinions are fundamentally shaped by our experiences. Our first swim in the deep end was faced with very unprecedented uncertainty. How do you learn to swim efficiently remotely? How do you learn to swim when you're afraid that you'll be the first person taken out of the pool? How do you learn to swim when you're already in competition against AI? All of these experiences as your first encounter into the workforce really just heightens how our core values are directly correlated with work, rather than treating the two as separate entities.
And what about some of the things that you see on the screen here? Like I'm seeing Dahlia's posting something in the chat about the difference between work-life balance and work-life integration. This is a big thing. Employers are still worried about this. I think we all kind of know that work-life balance is important, but we're asking ourselves questions like, what does that really mean to Gen Z? And what can we do to offer solutions? So can you help us think through, why do you think your peers are finding work-life balance so critical to the jobs they want to work in post-graduation?
Yeah, I think it's just more so the fact that Gen Z wants to have an impact, and we want to know that the work that we're doing is going to be seen and valued and used. And so it's really frustrating when you work really hard on a project and you don't get to see the end of it, which is why I think organizations should have a clear understanding of qualitative goals for the employee and quantitative goals for the company, so we both mutually understand how our success is mutual, and that goes hand in hand with work-life balance. And that ultimately, in terms of job preferences, is what attracted me to my favorite organization, was their sort of goal setting and learning plans for me, as well as sort of those culture things, job security, competitive salary, benefits, and all of those things like that. And taken together, really just going hand in hand with the goal setting and learning plans. I just think feedback is just a continuous conversation because Gen Zs want to be continuously growing, and that just goes hand in hand.
Yeah, and thanks for that. So tying together some of that core value piece to the organizational preferences, building on what you've just said, can you sort of reiterate or just build for us a little a stronger picture around what's going on here when we talk about growth and development and self-transcendence, and how that might influence the organizations you want to work for? Is this really like at the top of your list when you're thinking about possible employers?
Yeah, I definitely think when you're really early on in your career, you want to have a really good relationship with your manager, where you can develop sort of that mentor-mentee type of thing, where you can have that mutual trust within each other. I think it's more so having your manager challenge you with tasks, and you can demonstrate your aptitude for those tasks, as well as providing space for your ideas and providing your unique perspective on the task at hand. And so when you have that mutual trust within each other, I think you can both grow together. And I think that's something what Gen Z looks for with respect to those growth opportunities, is having someone fulfill a mentorship capacity.
That's great. So you're reading my mind. Let's move on. Thanks for that, Ingrid, because I do want to eventually get to talking about people within organizations, supervisors in particular. So let's move on to the next part of the presentation, but let's keep in mind, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And just to queue up, we've got a quick video from some students at Waterloo who are talking about
as a student kind of going into
to
the co-op program. Obviously, imposter syndrome is really there, and sometimes you're coming with a lack of confidence and just a lot of questions and not always the most resources, but having an employer that's understanding and recognizes that this is your first, time dipping your toes into whatever field that you're in is really incredible.
Yeah, it was actually my first fully hybrid term, so I was able to, right from the get-go, sort of manage my own time and choose whether or not I went to the office or stayed at home. And it really provided me with great flexibility.
I think that young people care a lot, just generally about others, and care about doing work that will be helpful to people, being able to do work that genuinely impacts people, and being able to sort of like see the results of your work and see the impact that you're having on people is something that I and I'm sure a lot of others really value.
And I think they provide a lot of fresh perspectives and a lot of new ways of thinking that can really enrich and really push forward a work environment or a culture at a job.
I think it's more about the work that we can bring and the creativity and seeing things from different aspects and really considering equity and justice and all these things in the work that we do.
I think someone that helps you determine what your boundaries are, as opposed to just kind of throwing you out into the deep end. Although I think there is importance for, figuring out what works for you, but someone that helps you determine, what's too much at sometimes, and also helps you pace yourself so that you're not drowning.
They do see the benefits of work-life balance 100%. I think I want more of a work-life balance than my parents had, than my grandparents had. And I think it's more about prioritizing your own well-being and your mental health and being able to be a better worker because of it.
Who doesn't want more work-life balance? But it's interesting, in versions of this presentation that we've given in the past, someone asked, yeah, but aren't we all kind of like Gen Z? Are these values actually unique to that generation? And I don't know, we're still exploring that question. But what I can tell you is that the labor market conditions are different for Gen Z than they have been in the past. For our grandparents' generation, like the last student was talking about, you got a job and then you kind of stuck there. Whereas for the last few years, lots of employers have really struggled to recruit the right people. And if they've failed to deliver on the promise of things like work-life balance, Gen Z workers have left. They've gone to competitors. They've continued to search for places where they think that they can find that, which is why you see now in the news people talking about things like job hopping and ghosting. We shouldn't blame Gen Z for this. They're really just trying to find a better life and better work conditions for themselves and each other. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the things that organizations can do to deliver on that promise. So how can we support Gen Z? We asked several questions that really aim to provide concrete data around what you can do. And that's what I'm going to show you over the next few slides. So we know that the first big theme is about work-life balance. What does that actually mean, though? What can organizations focus on to try to create conditions for work-life balance? Or what some of the folks in the chat are talking about in terms of work-life integration. And pretty clearly, Gen Z is saying, we want to work for a place that distinguishes work and other domains of life. My work is my work, and my other things that I do are not work. And on the one hand, that seems pretty simple. On the other hand, it's kind of paradoxical, because if you look at the next bar, oh, by the way, I want to take appointments during work hours. I imagine when you hear that, you can kind of snicker yourself and say, oh, these Gen Z, they just haven't been around long enough to know what work life really means. I would challenge that, though. I would think it requires us to have a fundamental rethink about what the working day actually looks like. And I think what Gen Z is saying is the Monday to Friday working, the Saturday, Sunday off is a model that worked for a really long time, but maybe it doesn't work anymore. And even within those days of the week, maybe 9 to 5 isn't the best for us, for me. Maybe I want to work when I'm working, but that doesn't necessarily mean Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. This might be not new for some of the people tuning in today, but if you haven't considered that, I think it requires a discussion with your workforce and asking open and honest questions around what you want your workday to look like, and how can I, as the employer, as a representative of the organization, structure that for you. We also have some information about training and development. Oh, sorry, before I go on. So we asked a question about, we understand that work-life balance is important. However, what's the role of sort of these themes within recruitment? And about half of the people we asked said, by the way, I'm not going to bring this up during recruitment. And we anticipate that means people are fearful of the response they might get from recruiters. For example, if I'm sitting across from a recruiter and I say, what I really care about is taking appointments during work hours, what are you going to do to offer that? The recruiter might say, wow, that's pretty entitled. We haven't even started the working relationship yet, and you're talking about time off. What Gen Z is actually saying is, what are you doing to create situations that support my work-life balance? And I think it requires us to have these conversations early and often with potential job candidates. But you should be mindful that you're probably not going to hear it. And if you're then asking, where are all these people? It's because we need to start the conversation. This shouldn't be new. When we asked this question in the past, and I imagine when Anne asked you at the beginning of the presentation, you probably all nailed it. Gen Z want to work hybrid. If this is new to you, it's probably because your assumption was they all want to work remotely. Not so. And in fact, I think it's Dragos had a question in the chat here that said, how do you assess positive social connection? Do networking events or coffee chats make an impact on that? Well, I think, Dragos, the response is, yeah, they're really important to Gen Z, perhaps more important than ever before. They really do want to work in person with coworkers, but only sometimes. And as Anne has told me in the past, I think the solution is we have to create organizational value propositions. We have to give people a good reason to come into a shared physical space. If we create that reason, Gen Z will respond positively. But if the reason is absent, then we'll hear further and further complaints about things like commute time and why am I coming in to sit on a computer screen. But the overwhelming preference there is for hybrid work. The other key theme we heard about was learning. And on the next slide, we've also got some stuff about career development. When we asked, what can organizations do to support your learning? Loud and clear, they said, I want to work for a supervisor who is prepared to give me constructive feedback. You're just seeing the words constructive feedback on the slide, but the data are actually about direct supervisors. And so the critical takeaway here is you have to ask yourself, what am I doing to help my frontline supervisors give that good feedback? It's not necessarily a natural skill. Some people are great at it, others less so. What are you doing to train people on that? Gen Z are craving for it. If they end up working for someone who isn't great at feedback, that's a real opportunity lost. A second point before we move on, senior mentorship. Gen Z are telling us, I really want to know how someone got to the top of the organization. How do they get from A to B? And it's perhaps as simple as those coffee chats that one of the participants was talking about earlier. We just need to get some connection between Gen Z and people at the top of the organization so we can learn about how to go from A to B. And that's really connected to what you see on the next slide about career development. When we asked, what can organizations do to support your career development? The overarching takeaway was, I just want to have the criteria for my success laid out clearly in front of me, the promotion criteria. Just tell me what I got to do. What do I have to do to go from A to B? How do I get from my position at the bottom of the organization to one elsewhere? And that's kind of interesting because that's free. That doesn't cost a dime. However, you have to ask yourself, are these things that we make clear early and often? And if not, maybe there's an opportunity for you to clarify that for your Gen Z workers. So those are just a couple key findings from our survey data. I'm going to throw it back to Anne to help us make sense of what does this all mean.
Thanks so much, Dave. Before I dive into the summary, I've been really enjoying reading the questions and the comments in the chat, and I know we have so much to share with one another. I thought maybe we might invite Ingrid back in just for a couple of quick questions to answer how your employers have supported your work-life balance and your learning and development thus far in your co-op work terms, because you've been kind of through the pandemic of work terms, so fully remote and hybrid, and now starting your first job. What have you seen that has been really effective for you?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned it in the chat, but integration is definitely the key facet to work-life balance. In my experience, one company that I work for created work-life balance starting within the workday by offering access to, fitness sessions, de-stress events, even things like lunch and learns, because these practices provide space for downtime as well as for me to prioritize things like my mental and physical health. And because of these activities, I also had the opportunity to sort of connect with other employees that I wouldn't normally have the opportunity to connect with. And I felt more comfortable approaching them, as well as developing a more personal relationship with my supervisor as well as my team, which leads to just a more productive and efficient architecture of your company, really.
Thanks. That's so fantastic, Ingrid. And I think that aligns with another comment that we heard in the workplace in terms of, in the chat, sorry, about students being comfortable coming into the workplace as long as they're able to develop those relationships. And back to what Dave was saying in terms of, really having an opportunity to connect with people when you're in the workplace.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And do you have any other last comments to share with us before we move in to wrap up, Ingrid?
No, I think we can lead to audience questions.
Okay, that's great. So I'll just take a minute and do a quick little wrap up here. I want to acknowledge, I've seen in the comments as well, that we have so many of you on the call with us today, and you're dealing with really different organizational structures. So there was a comment about some of our colleagues that work in a hospital, and it's not always easy or possible at all to manage some of these new work structures, like allowing people to go off and have appointments in the middle of the day. We are presenting some findings and some general best practices, but what we would recommend to each of you is that you think about what levers you can push on. If you can't create a hybrid work environment, how might you create more training and development opportunities for your staff, more of those opportunities for them to develop relationships together in the workplace, to build those friendships? What sort of social and networking activities might you be able to provide? So as our high level recap, Gen Z, as we started the presentation, is looking for that value alignment. It's really important to be clear on your organization's values and to demonstrate how your organization lives these values. We've seen this in previous research as well. It's not enough to give lip service to a handful of values that you think are going to appeal to Gen Z. They're looking for a specific and concrete plan as to how you actually live those values. And in particular, our students shared with us that they're looking to work in organizations that are going to support their personal growth, that support equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as individuality. And as we've already discussed at length, jobs that offer that work-life balance or integration and security. And that might butt up against some of the conceptions that we have about Gen Z doing this job hopping and not wanting to commit to an organization or really looking for that gig work. I don't think that that's the case. At least that's not what our students shared with us. But as Dave mentioned, they're looking for the organization that's going to support them in it in order to stay. So if we can go to the next slide. a couple of things that you can specifically do to support this. Advertise the work-life balance structures that you do have in place at your organization. As Dave mentioned, students aren't likely to ask that question during the recruitment period. And so if you're able to share those values, the structures, the benefits that you have in place with the students, that's going to help. And managing work-life balance, again, this came up in the chat a fair bit. I think we're all still learning how to do this, but the clearer boundaries that we can put in place, if we can give our students, our employees, programs, wellness programs on managing what that work-life integration actually looks like, it's going to help all of us. Flexible time and space when possible is certainly something that this next generation is looking for. And as Dave mentioned, that development capability within our supervisors. So what training and development can you offer to your supervisors to help them chart career paths for young employees? That's going to help them see the trajectory and increase their desire to stay within the organization. And following directly from that, clarifying that career development path. So what kinds of skills, competencies, experience are needed to move across positions within your organizations? And as positions change quickly, this can be a fair amount of work, but really showing students and Gen Z that there's potential to grow within the organization and that you're going to support their training and development to do so is going to be key to engaging them and then retaining them within your organizations. So let's move on to some of the questions. I know there's been a lot that have come in as we've been chatting, and we did get some in advance as well. And so let's start with one that was pre-submitted for Ingrid while we get a few more questions in. What are students looking for in a manager in their internship term? So what types of responsibilities are they looking for in their internships? Is it more autonomy, more observation and supervision? What's your experience with that, Ingrid?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it definitely starts with just expressing interest and concern for your students' personal well-being as well as their career development. I think it goes back to that trust piece, and I think that's a vital way to support just employees' learning and development. I remember when I worked at one of my co-op positions, I was tasked with one project, demonstrated my aptitude successfully, and was continuously challenged with one project after another. And because we developed that mutual trust within each other, I could go to my supervisor and say, hey, can I take a stab at this? And they would say, yeah, go for it. So like I said, I definitely think it starts with expressing interest and concern for your students, what they want to get out of their co-op experience. And definitely just that resonates with probably employees in general. What are they trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. You know, it's so fascinating that you say that, Ingrid, because we have seen that come up time and time again in our research as well. And I always try and be really explicit when we talk to employers because, of course, we want to welcome all of our employees into our organizations and better understand what they want to learn and how we can support them. But I think it's really critical that when we bring students in, work integrated learning students or new hires, that we're aware of their lack of experience navigating the workplace, and that we make those really overt efforts to say, we're so excited to have you. What are you interested in? How might we find some projects that align with your interests? And then once, as you say, that trust is established, that's where the real magic happens. And our employers are often just overwhelmed with the quality of work that the students are able to produce. So that's great. Okay, some more questions for us. So let's see here. Yes, there's a couple questions about whether or not we would share the slides. Very happy to share the slides with you, as well as the presentation. We'll also give you the link to our website, and on our website you will find all of our previous research studies, and we'll have some summaries of this Gen Z research available soon as well. So let's see, I'm just looking at, okay. it's amazing that finally society is understanding and accepting that workers are not robots, but humans. Yeah, so isn't that an interesting thing as well? That I think earlier Dave said in a previous presentation, someone had said, aren't we all Gen Z? Well, yes, in some ways, I think we're finally responding to these kinds of pushes in the labor market that have been kind of quietly creeping up over time, and now we as you know, full-time workers are saying, wait a minute, we agree with some of these things that Gen Z is saying. And the irony is that as this technology kind of influences our day-to-day work more and more, we're treating people more and more like humans, or we have to do so in order to engage them and retain them, and we're really going to have to do so in order to support them and their growth. So let's see, do we have some more questions here? There is a question about the right to disconnect law in Ontario and whether or not this will expand to other provinces. I would say that we'll probably not experts on the legislative potential, but I think the right to disconnect is a really good example of the complexity of trying to manage work-life balance and work-life integration. And I think we've all sort of struggled with that we might be working in the evenings one night and we're aware of our colleagues and their right to disconnect, and yet working that evening or on the weekend is the best possible option for us at that moment in time. So I don't know, Dave and Ingrid, if you have any comments on that one.
I mean, that's a tough one. And just to reiterate, like you said, we're not looking at the legislation when we're collecting these sorts of data. We're really just trying to study the psychology of work and what do people want, with the asterisk that sometimes people don't always get what they want. Sometimes they don't know what they want. I think the key theme that's emerged is that Gen Z are saying, all we want is to start with a conversation about what this could look like. And I think what Ingrid has said so eloquently is it's a back and forth. Right? Gen Z is saying, we want to have that conversation, but also tell me what I have to do to satisfy my end of the bargain. It's not to say that we should all just, stop what we're doing and start over for Gen Z, but we need to be open and honest that they do have a lot of power in the labor market right now. And so we should at least be talking about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. We have a question for Ingrid here. It's, how do you assess whether you fit with the company's culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard because sometimes it's not really articulated until you have that interview, which is problematic because then you don't apply for that job because you don't really know much about the company, even though you are doing that external research and you go to the company's website and you can't really tell much of anything about the culture. Sometimes what I do is I tell students to go to the company's LinkedIn page after they apply and connect with an employee or a recruiter and just talk to them casually, like those coffee chats, or try to get a sense of what other employees think about that company. But because you have to do all of those external things on your own, I think that's a problem, that companies aren't leveraging that sort of information on the description before people apply, as well as articulating it in the interview and making sure that that's known without the potential candidate having to ask and really try to get that information out of there, because you could be missing out on a lot of people not applying because that information isn't articulated before the interview, and sometimes it's too late.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a great response that leads directly into another question that we have here. And so you've sort of answered it from the student perspective. I might turn it back to Dave from a research perspective. When in the process should values be shared in the job posting, in the interview, and during onboarding? So Dave, do you want to share a little bit about some of the job posting values research that we've done?
Yeah, so really great question. Thanks, Katie, for asking that. I think I'd start with a couple points. The one is it's critical to share those values. Sharing meaning expressing them, stating them explicitly. Don't leave it up to the job seeker or the potential candidate to guess at what the values are. Employers have to be stating, this is what's important to us. There's a challenge in trying to communicate that, because I think values are something that people live. It's hard to express it. You can write it down, and to some extent that will work, and I'll share a little bit about what that's meant in our research. But I think there's lots of opportunities for things like training your recruiters to understand and live their lives in accordance with organizational values, and to somehow demonstrate those when they're connecting with job candidates. I think there's something very human about values that's sometimes lost on, say, a website. And I think it really will take some social interaction to get it right. Putting that aside, we have done some research to try to figure out what this might look like in things like job descriptions. And it turns out that Gen Z seem pretty skeptical about written sentences that says, we value this, we value learning and development, come work for us. They actually don't seem particularly attracted to those sorts of job descriptions. What they really want to see is evidence that the organization is prepared to deliver on that. So when the organization has some sort of recruitment material that says, we get it, guys, you really care about work-life balance, you care about learning. By the way, here are all the things that we're doing very explicitly to deliver on that. That boosts attraction exponentially. Like, it's a really big deal. So my caution would be, don't just write it down and expect it's going to work. You actually have to, put your money where your mouth is. You got to develop a clear plan. And if you do that, that's the key to success.
Thanks, Dave. That's really helpful. And I think that Kayla might have put some of the links in the chat where our attendees can access that research. There was another question, and I'd like to turn it to both Dave and Ingrid for your thoughts on it. But it had to do with the question of sustainability. And I think when you look at the list of values, the fact that sustainability kind of showed up rather low in that list might be surprising to some of us, because we do know how important that value is for many Gen Z. I think what I would say in terms of a response to that one is that the fact that sustainability showed up low doesn't mean that it's not important, but that this was a ranking question. And Dave mentioned this earlier in terms of kind of the pragmatism that Gen Z needs to have in terms of finding a job that can pay the rent and finding a job that's going to give opportunities for promotion and growth. And so that's been our kind of initial reaction to that lower ranking on the sustainability piece. But maybe I'll really quickly turn it over to the two of you to see if you have any additional comments to add on that, the importance of sustainability and perhaps why it wasn't ranked as highly as we might have thought.
Ingrid, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on that. I'm really curious, actually.
I think, like you said, because it was a ranking, it just boiled down to the other facets that were there. But I think in terms of sustainability, it kind of goes hand in hand with prestige. It's like a company says that we're sustainable and we're doing all these environmentally friendly things. But again, you don't really know what you're doing besides just saying that you're doing it. And like I said, that's sometimes not really articulated until the interviewing or your onboarding for the job. So when it's up against other items that are just of higher priority, it just goes down, I guess.
What a great way to wrap this up, Ingrid, which I think is to put a really fine point on the importance of living values. Let's move to our wrap-up slides. I see there are still so many questions and comments in the chat, and I wish we had more time together. So this is my invitation to you to stay connected to us. As I mentioned, we will have the recording and the slides up available for you to access. We'll send a message out to you on that one, but we also have lots of resources up on our website. We also want to alert you to the fact that September 20th is going to be our next webinar. We've just done some research on the barriers faced by our students from equity deserving groups in terms of meaningful and inclusive work integrated learning experiences. And we're really excited to share that with you in September as well. And thank you once again to everyone. Thanks for your patience with our challenges today. It's fantastic engaging with you, and we hope to see you again in September.